Entering the luxury aircraft dealership on a cold winter morning in Denver, Colorado, the air was thick with ostentation and silent judgments. Ethan Reynolds, a farmer with a simple appearance, dressed in worn-out jeans and a flannel shirt stained with dirt, seemed out of place in the immaculate environment. His expression was "Can I help you?" One of the salesmen, Derek, asked with a tone bordering on sarcasm as he adjusted his tie. Ethan looked him directly in the eye without flinching. "Yes, I'm here to see the Cessna Citation XLS Plus model. I want detailed information about it." The comment caused a brief silence. The other employees exchanged glances, and a few mocking smiles emerged around the room. Derek tilted his head slightly as if trying to gauge whether the customer was serious. "The Cessna Citation? That's an interesting choice. It's quite exclusive." The word exclusive came out dripping with veiled scorn. As Ethan calmly replied, explaining that he knew exactly what he wanted, the murmurs around him grew louder. A few customers, businessmen in impeccable suits and women dressed elegantly, watched curiously as the farmer stood his ground. "I think this gentleman walked into the wrong store," a blonde woman whispered to the man beside her, holding a champagne glass. Derek hesitated for a moment before turning to a colleague, clearly trying to maintain appearances. "Kyle, please bring the catalog and see if Mr. Reynolds needs anything else." "No need for a catalog. I prefer to see the aircraft in person," Ethan interrupted firmly. "And if you don't mind, I'd like to speak to someone who actually knows about these things." Ethan's assertiveness seemed to unsettle the group. Kyle shot a look at Derek before going to fetch the manager, an older man named Richard Lawson, who exuded authority but also skepticism. When he arrived, Richard assessed Ethan with a neutral expression. "I'm Richard, the general manager. May I ask what brings you here today?" Ethan adjusted his cowboy hat and took a deep breath. "I'm interested in buying a plane, a Cessna Citation XLS Plus. I have business to handle across states, and my family needs a more efficient transportation solution." Richard narrowed his eyes, trying to measure Ethan's seriousness. "Of course, sir. This model is ideal for executive travel and short interstate trips. But perhaps I can suggest something a bit more accessible?" The suggestion was made politely, but the judgment was thinly veiled. Before Ethan could reply, a nearby customer let out a low chuckle, drawing everyone's attention. "I bet he wants to finance it for 30 years, he said mockingly. The laughter echoed, heightening the discomfort in the room. Ethan remained unmoving, his gaze fixed on Richard. "I'm not here for jokes. I have a very serious proposal and an even more serious reason for being here. If you don't want to assist me, I'll go to another dealership that values my time and money." That statement brought an uncomfortable silence. Ethan's firmness was beginning to destabilize the disdainful attitudes of the staff and customers around him. Richard took a deep breath, aware that the situation was slipping out of control, and finally decided to lead Ethan to the aircraft. As they walked toward the hangar, the group curiously watched Ethan. He could feel the weight of their judgments, but he didn't care. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about saving his daughter. The hangar's lights softly illuminated the sleek silver fuselage of the Cessna Citation XLS Plus. It was an imposing aircraft, with an aerodynamic design that reflected perfection and luxury. Ethan walked alongside Richard while Derek and Kyle trailed slightly behind, maintaining a discreet distance but clearly observing his every move. Ethan appeared unfazed by the tension, focused solely on the machine before him. "So, Mr. Reynolds, this is the Cessna Citation XLS Plus," Richard began, adjusting his tone to sound more welcoming. "It seats up to 12 passengers, has a range of approximately 2,000 miles, and interiors that can be customized to your liking. Perfect for executive or even personal travel." Ethan inspected every detail carefully, his calloused hands clasped behind his back. "And the maintenance? How does the technical support work?" His clear and direct question seemed to catch Richard off guard, who didn't expect a customer so informed. "Well, we offer comprehensive maintenance packages," Richard replied, regaining his professional demeanor. "This includes support in various locations and a periodic review plan to ensure maximum performance." As Ethan listened, Derek couldn't resist making a low but audible comment. "He talks like he's actually going to buy it." Ethan turned slowly, fixing Derek with a firm gaze. He didn't say a word, but the ensuing silence was more eloquent than any retort could be. Richard, sensing the unease, cleared his throat. "If you'd like, Mr. Reynolds, I can show you the interior." "I'd like that. Please." Ethan's voice was calm but laced with determination. Inside the aircraft, the luxury was even more striking. Soft leather seats, gleaming wood finishes, and a control panel that looked straight out of a futuristic movie. Ethan ran his fingers along the backrest of one of the seats, taking in the atmosphere. "It's impressive," he finally said. "My daughter would love this." The mention of his daughter seemed unexpected, and for a brief moment, Richard caught a glimpse of something different in Ethan's expression, a flash of emotion he couldn't quite place. "She must be very lucky," Richard commented, trying to ease the interaction. "Surely a plane like this would be an extraordinary gift." Ethan gave a faint smile but didn't respond immediately. He seemed lost in thought before turning to Richard. "And what about the pilot? I have experience with agricultural aviation, but I'll need someone qualified for this model. Do you offer training or recommendations?" The question once again surprised Richard, who began to see that Ethan wasn't just a curious bystander. "Yes, sir. We work with certified flight schools for training on aircraft of this scale. We can also recommend experienced pilots for immediate operation." Ethan nodded. "Good. I'll need that." Ethan nodded. "Good. I'll need that." His voice carried a determination that further intrigued Richard. Something about the man suggested there was much more to his visit than met the eye. As they exited the aircraft, Richard excused himself momentarily and discreetly approached Derek and Kyle. "I think we've been judging this man too quickly," he murmured. "I want him to be treated with the same respect as any other client." Derek shrugged, but Kyle looked uneasy. "Do you really think he can afford this?" "I doubt it. Just look at him." "It's not our appearance that pays the bills," Richard said firmly. "Let's find out what he really wants before jumping to conclusions." Outside, Ethan stood near the wing of the plane, staring at the horizon through the hangar's large open door. When Richard returned, Ethan was ready with more questions. "So, Mr. Reynolds, if I may ask, what's the primary purpose of this purchase? Personal transportation? Business?" Ethan took a deep breath before answering. "Business, in part. But above all, I want to ensure my daughter has access to the medical treatment she needs. She's very sick, and the doctor said she can't endure long car rides to Denver for her appointments. This plane is my only solution." Richard was taken aback by Ethan's candor. His words seemed to dispel any remaining doubt. "I understand, Mr. Reynolds. That's certainly a noble motivation." Ethan gave a faint, sad smile. "She's everything I have, and I'd do anything to see her well." As the group digested his words, Derek whispered something to Kyle. "This has to be some kind of emotional trick." Ethan heard him. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Derek. With calm but piercing intensity, he said, "You know what's funny? Everyone thinks they know enough about you at first glance, but no one knows what you carry in your heart." The silence that followed was crushing. Derek looked at the floor, uncomfortable, while Richard tried to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Reynolds, I believe we can do something special for you. Let's meet to discuss financing and customization options. We'd like to help you with this purchase." Ethan nodded. "Thank you, but I want to make one thing clear. Money won't be a problem. I'll pay in cash." Derek and Kyle exchanged shocked glances, while Richard struggled to maintain composure. "Of course, sir. We're here to help." As Ethan prepared to leave the dealership, he had one final request. "Can you arrange a flight demonstration?" "Absolutely," Richard replied. "We'll schedule it for tomorrow." Ethan nodded, walking out with firm steps. He felt the stairs behind him but didn't care. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about saving his daughter. The next morning, the Denver sky was clear, dotted with a few clouds on the horizon. Ethan arrived at the hangar precisely at 9 o'clock, as scheduled. He dressed the same way as before, but there was something different about his demeanor, a visible, unshakable determination. Richard and his team were already waiting, with the Cessna Citation XLS Plus positioned on the runway, ready for the demonstration flight. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds," Richard said, shaking his hand firmly. "We're ready for the flight. Our pilot, Mr. Carter, is one of the most experienced in our team. He'll answer all your technical questions during the demonstration." Ethan nodded, observing the uniformed pilot who smiled politely and extended his hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Reynolds. Let's get to work." As the small group moved toward the plane, Derek, who seemed to be there only out of obligation, muttered to Kyle, "This should be interesting. I can't wait to see how he reacts when he finds out this toy burns more fuel per hour than he probably earns in a month." Ethan, without turning around, spoke firmly but calmly. "You know, Derek, people don't need to flaunt wealth to have it. Those who work hard value every penny. Maybe you should learn that." Derek's face hardened, but he said nothing. Richard cast a reproachful look at the employee before accompanying Ethan to the plane. Inside the cabin, as the pilot explained procedures and checked controls, Ethan studied every detail. He asked precise questions about the navigation systems, fuel consumption, and load capacity. His inquiries weren't those of an amateur, but of someone who had done his homework. "You seem to have a good understanding of aviation, Mr. Reynolds," Carter noted, adjusting the controls. "Do you work in the field?" "I worked as a crop dusting pilot for a few years," Ethan replied simply. "But this is another level. I want to make sure everything is done safely. I can't take any risks." The comment caused a pause. Ethan didn't need to elaborate further. It was clear to everyone that there was something deeper driving this purchase. With the plane now moving down the runway, Carter announced, "We're taking off. Please sit back and enjoy the flight." When the Cessna finally left the ground, Ethan watched Denver shrink below them. The feeling was familiar, but now it carried a different weight. He wasn't just flying. He was evaluating the means to save his daughter's life. The following days were a whirlwind for Ethan. Between conversations with Richard and final adjustments to the purchase, the weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever. Though he had secured the purchase with an upfront payment, it meant jeopardizing the farm's financial security for a while. Yet Ethan never wavered. Abby was his priority. When the contract was finally signed and the pilot for the first flight confirmed, Ethan felt a wave of relief. "I'll pick up the plane tomorrow," he told Richard. "I want everything ready by 9 a.m. Richard nodded, impressed by how swiftly Ethan had handled the process. "Of course, Mr. Reynolds. It will be our pleasure to assist with anything you need." That evening, on his way home, Ethan decided to stop at a local toy store. It had been months since he'd bought something special for Abby, and he wanted to surprise her with a doll she had casually mentioned weeks ago. He entered the store feeling slightly out of place among the bright aisles filled with cheerful families. A young store clerk smiled at him. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Ethan replied. "I'm looking for a doll. She has blonde hair and a blue dress. I think her name is Emily." "Oh, of course." The clerk disappeared for a moment and returned with the doll. "Here it is. She's one of the most popular with kids." Ethan carefully held the box, picturing Abby's smile when she saw it. "I'll take it." As he paid for the doll, a man in a suit standing nearby observed the transaction curiously. When Ethan carried the box out of the store, the man stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir. May I speak with you for a moment?" His voice was polite but firm. Ethan frowned, surprised. "What do you want?" "My name is Michael Hayes. I'm a representative of the bank that manages your farm's mortgage. I recently received a notification about a large financial movement from your account. We're concerned about the impact this might have on your assets." Ethan stood silent for a moment, his jaw clenched. "That's my problem, not the bank's." "I understand, Mr. Reynolds, but we need to ensure the terms of the mortgage are upheld. A purchase of this size could put your property at risk if you're unable to keep up with payments." Ethan gripped the doll's bag tightly. He had expected this kind of reaction, but it didn't lessen the frustration he felt. "Listen, Hayes, you don't need to worry. I know exactly what I'm doing." The man seemed ready to argue further, but Ethan's glare made him reconsider. "Very well, Mr. Reynolds, just be cautious." He handed over a card with the bank's contact information. "If you need to discuss your situation, don't hesitate to reach out." Ethan took the card without looking at it and walked back to his truck. The interaction left a bitter taste, but he didn't have time for distractions. All that mattered was Abby. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the hangar where the plane was waiting. Richard, Derek, and Kyle were there, along with the pilot, Carter. Ethan performed a final inspection of the plane before boarding. Richard handed him the finalized documents and contract. "Everything's ready, Mr. Reynolds." Ethan shook his hand. "Thank you for everything. I'll take my daughter to the hospital today. This is the start of something better." The plane took off on schedule. Abby was quiet but visibly excited. "This is so different, Daddy. I can see the clouds so close." Her voice carried a mix of awe and exhaustion. Ethan smiled, relieved to have her there, away from the grueling car rides. "Now you'll have more energy for your treatments. You're going to feel better, I promise." However, Ethan's relief was cut short when the pilot's radio picked up an unexpected transmission. "Cessna Citation XLS Plus, this is Denver Air Traffic Control. There's an issue with your flight plan records. We need you to return to the airport immediately." Ethan froze as Carter took control. "Understood, Control. We're returning." "Is this some kind of mistake?" Ethan asked, confused. "Why are we going back?" Carter looked uneasy. "I'm not sure, sir. This is rare, but it might be an administrative issue. We'll clarify once we land." Back at the hangar, Ethan was met by Richard, who looked troubled. "Mr. Reynolds, there's been an issue with the aircraft's documentation. It appears an anonymous request was made to review your purchase." "An anonymous request?" Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" Richard hesitated. "It means someone challenged the legitimacy of the transaction, claiming potential fraud. This is a standard security protocol." Ethan felt his blood boil. "Who would do this? I've done everything by the book. I paid up front. You have my money, don't you?" "Yes, we do, Mr. Reynolds," Richard assured him. "But until this is resolved, we can't clear the aircraft for further flights. I need you to stay while we investigate." Ethan looked over at Abby, who was sitting in the plane's cabin, holding the doll he'd bought her. Her expression was one of disappointment, though she said nothing. He turned back to Richard. "This needs to be resolved today. My daughter needs her treatment. I can't wait." As Richard tried to calm the situation, Ethan noticed Derek and Kyle whispering to each other in the background, their expressions suggesting they knew more than they were letting on. Ethan walked up to them, his voice low and dangerous. "What do you know about this?" Derek shrugged, but Kyle, clearly nervous, avoided eye contact. Ethan locked eyes with Derek. "If you had anything to do with this, I'll find out. And when I do, you'll regret it." The silence in the hangar was heavy. Ethan returned to Abby, trying to hide his growing frustration. He knew something bigger was happening, something that could jeopardize everything, and he wouldn't let that happen. Ethan stood in the hangar, his mind racing as he stared at the grounded plane. Each passing minute felt heavier, the weight of the delay pressing down on him. Abby sat quietly in the cabin, her doll clutched tightly to her chest, trying to mask her disappointment. Ethan knew he couldn't let her wait much longer. Richard approached Ethan with an apologetic expression. "Mr. Reynolds, we're doing everything we can to resolve this. I promise you that this will be sorted out as quickly as possible." But Ethan wasn't satisfied. Deep down, he felt that someone was actively working against him. The uneasy presence of Derek and Kyle only fueled his suspicion. He turned to Richard. "I need to know who filed this complaint. I don't have time for red tape." Richard sighed, looking genuinely concerned. "I understand your frustration, but anonymous complaints are standard in these situations. Only the authorities can access the records." Ethan exhaled sharply, trying to hold back his anger. "I don't care how it's done. Just get it resolved. My daughter can't wait." Abby exited the cabin at that moment, walking slowly toward her father. "Daddy, why aren't we flying yet? I thought we'd already be at the hospital." The sight of her pale face and soft voice tightened Ethan's chest. He knelt down to meet her gaze. "We're having a little problem, Princess, but I promise we'll fix it soon. Do you trust me?" Abby nodded slowly. "I trust you, but I don't want you to worry so much about me." She placed her small hand on his face, her eyes full of a wisdom that seemed far beyond her 10 years. Ethan smiled, swallowing the lump in his throat, and kissed her forehead. "I'm doing this because I love you." Meanwhile, Derek, unable to hide his arrogance, muttered to Kyle, "If he'd handled this the right way, he wouldn't be in this mess." Ethan heard it. He turned sharply, his eyes blazing. "Derek, enough of the games. What do you know? If you're involved in this, confess now before it gets worse." Derek hesitated but remained defiant. "I don't know anything. Maybe the problem is you trying to play big shot when you clearly don't have the means." Ethan took a step toward him, but Richard quickly intervened, stepping between them. "That's enough, Derek. Your behavior has been inappropriate from the start. If you can't contribute constructively, leave the hangar." Derek muttered something under his breath and walked off, but Ethan wasn't convinced. He turned to Richard. "He knows something. I can feel it." "I'll handle him, Mr. Reynolds," Richard assured him. "For now, let's focus on clearing up this issue. I've contacted the aviation department to expedite the process." Ethan stepped outside the hangar, needing a moment to clear his head. He pulled out his phone and dialed someone he trusted implicitly, his lawyer, Ben Walker. Ben answered after the first ring. "Ethan, what's going on?" "I'm in trouble, Ben. I bought a plane to get Abby to her treatments, but someone's challenged the transaction. I need you to find out who's behind this." Ben paused before responding. "That's strange. Anonymous complaints like this usually require a valid reason. It sounds like someone's trying to sabotage you." "That's exactly what I think. Can you help me?" "I'm on it," Ben replied. "Where are you now?" "I'm at the Denver aviation hangar. Can you come here?" "I'm on my way. Don't do anything rash until I get there." While waiting for Ben, Ethan took Abby to a nearby cafe to distract her. She ordered hot chocolate while he nursed a strong coffee, his thoughts spinning. Around them, people glanced curiously, perhaps noting Ethan's rugged appearance in the more upscale setting, or perhaps sensing the tension emanating from him. Abby looked up at him with her large brown eyes. "You'll fix this, won't you, Daddy?" Ethan reached across the table to hold her hand. "I will, Princess. Nothing is going to stop us." Shortly after, Ben arrived, his tall frame and graying hair lending him an air of authority. "Ethan, I've made a few calls on the way. It seems the complaint was filed under financial grounds. Someone claimed you don't have the funds to sustain this purchase." "That's a lie," Ethan said firmly. "I paid in full. They have my money." "I know," Ben replied, "but it looks like someone wanted to trigger an investigation. The question is who and why." Back at the hangar, Ben joined Richard to discuss the necessary paperwork, while Ethan stayed close to Abby. She was drawing in her notebook, her face calm but focused. When Ethan glanced over, his heart broke at what he saw, a picture of herself holding his hand next to the plane, with the words, "Thank you, Daddy," written at the top. It renewed his resolve. He walked over to Ben. "What can we do to speed this up?" Ben sighed. "We need an official statement from the bank confirming that the funds are legitimate and the transaction is above board. That should cancel the complaint." "Then let's do it," Ethan replied. Ben called the bank and began coordinating the necessary documents. Meanwhile, Ethan noticed Derek in the distance, speaking on his phone. His nervous glances in Ethan's direction only heightened the farmer's suspicions. Ethan moved closer, trying to catch parts of the conversation. "I did what you asked," Derek said, his voice anxious. "I don't know why this is still happening. If they find out, you're on your own." Before Derek could hang up, Ethan stepped into the room. Derek turned abruptly, his face pale with guilt. "So it was you," Ethan said, his voice low and filled with fury. "You tried to sabotage this." Derek stammered, taking a step back. I didn't think it was right for you to buy something like this when you clearly don't have the means. And that gives you the right to interfere in my life?" Ethan advanced on him. "My daughter needs this plane. You have no idea what we're going through." Before Ethan could go further, Richard stepped between them again. "Mr. Reynolds, please, let's not make this worse." Ethan took a deep breath, his fists clenched. "If anything happens to my daughter because of this, Derek, it's on you." With Ben working to finalize the documents and Derek's betrayal exposed, Ethan felt the end was near, but he knew he couldn't let his guard down. Someone else might still be pulling the strings. Who was truly behind the sabotage? And what else might stand in the way of his fight for Abby? The hangar felt heavy, as if the air itself carried the weight of unresolved tension. Derek, now exposed as the instigator of the complaint, stood cornered. His weak attempts to justify his actions only deepened Ethan's fury. Meanwhile, Ben, Ethan's lawyer, was making swift progress in clearing the farmer's name. But the clock was ticking. Richard approached Ethan, his expression sincere. "Mr. Reynolds, I deeply regret everything that's happened. I'm ashamed of the way my staff has treated you, and I want to assure you that we're doing everything possible to fix this." Ethan nodded, his gaze locked on Derek. "I just want this to be over. My daughter can't wait." Moments later, Ben approached, holding up his phone. "I just spoke to the bank. They've confirmed the funds were transferred and that there's no irregularity in the transaction. The complaint has been officially dismissed." Relief coursed through Ethan, though he didn't let it show. "Does that mean we can fly?" Ben nodded. "Technically, yes, but we need official clearance from air traffic control. I'm working on it now." As Ben made the final calls, Ethan turned his attention to Abby, who was sitting quietly on a bench near the plane. He crouched beside her, taking her small hand in his. "Princess, it's almost time. We'll be flying soon," he said softly. Abby smiled faintly, her exhaustion evident. "I knew you'd fix it, Daddy. You always do." Her quiet faith in him reignited Ethan's resolve. He returned to Ben just as the lawyer ended his call. "Good news," Ben said. "We have clearance from air traffic control. You're good to go." Ethan didn't waste a second. He carried Abby to the plane, gently settling her into the cabin. Carter, the pilot, nodded reassuringly. "We're ready whenever you are, Mr. Reynolds." Richard approached as Ethan prepared to board. "Mr. Reynolds, once again, I apologize for everything. I wish you and your daughter the best." Ethan shook his hand firmly. "Make sure your staff learns something from this." As the plane taxied down the runway, Ethan held Abby's hand tightly. The Cessna's engines roared as it lifted into the clear Denver sky. For the first time in days, Ethan allowed himself a moment of peace. "This is so beautiful," Abby whispered, gazing out at the clouds. "It feels like we're flying to something better." Ethan smiled, squeezing her hand. "We are, Princess. We are." But the calm didn't last long. 20 minutes into the flight, Carter's voice broke through the intercom. "Mr. Reynolds, we're getting a warning about a hydraulic issue. It's nothing critical, but we'll need to make a precautionary landing." Ethan's heart sank. "What does that mean? Are we in danger?" "No, sir," Carter replied. "But I'll need to divert to a smaller airport nearby to ensure everything is safe." Ethan took a deep breath, glancing at Abby. She didn't seem to notice the tension, still captivated by the view outside. "Do whatever you need to do," Ethan told Carter. "Just keep my daughter safe." The landing was bumpy but controlled. At the small airport, mechanics quickly identified the problem, an issue with the hydraulic system that could be resolved within minutes. Carter approached Ethan with an apologetic look. "We'll be ready to go shortly, sir. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Ethan nodded. "Let's just keep moving." Finally, the plane reached its destination, the Denver Children's Hospital. Medical staff were waiting on the tarmac, ready to assist Abby. Ethan gently carried her out of the plane and handed her over to the team. "Daddy, you did it," Abby whispered as they took her away. "Thank you." Ethan didn't respond. He just held her hand until he couldn't anymore, watching as she disappeared into the hospital doors. Later that evening, Ethan received a call from Richard. "Mr. Reynolds, I wanted to inform you that Derek has been officially dismissed. His conduct was unacceptable." Ethan paused before replying. "I hope he learned something from this." "There's one more thing," Richard continued. "We'd like to offer you a year of free maintenance for the plane as a gesture of apology." "Thank you," Ethan said, though his tone was measured. He wasn't interested in favors. He wanted justice. The following day, Ethan sat by Abby's hospital bed, watching her sleep peacefully. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. He had kept his promise to her, but the fight was far from over. Later, a doctor entered the room with news that made Ethan's heart race. "Mr. Reynolds, we've reviewed Abby's case. and we believe she's a candidate for a new experimental treatment. The success rate is high, and the results could be life-changing, but it will require frequent trips to Denver. Ethan smiled, relief washing over him. That won't be a problem. We'll be here whenever you need us. That evening, as Ethan prepared to leave the hospital, Abby reached out and grabbed his hand. "You always say we're a team, Daddy," she said softly. "And with you, I know nothing can go wrong." Ethan knelt by her bed, his voice firm with emotion. "We are a team, Princess, and we're going to win this fight. Together." Ethan proved that love and determination could conquer any obstacle. He wasn't just a simple farmer. He was a father willing to move heaven and earth for his daughter, and that made all the difference.